Louis Uchitelle from the New York Times, and he will be speaking today on his book title, Disposable American. Did I get it right?
Layoffs and their consequences.
Okay. He's written on a wide range of subjects, including jobs and labor issues, national and international economic trends, corporate and labor economics, and the Federal Reserve System. Most recently, he's reported on the Asian crisis and global economic consequences, and on numerous aspects of the American economy as well as workforce trends. He currently writes Economic View, a column that appears on Sundays in the New York Times, I'm assuming. And since joining the Times in 1980, he's reported from Mexico, France, Russia, and Ukraine. He was previously with the Associated Press, where he had been a reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent in Latin America and a news executive. His reporting took him to Buenos Aires, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, as well as San Juan, Puerto Rico, with responsibilities for the Caribbean. He played a lead role in AP's coverage of the U.S. military intervention in the Dominican Republic. And, Lou, if I'm doing my math right, you would have been about 10 when that happened, right?
I was about 10.
Okay. That was in the mid-'60s, right? He began his journalism career as a general assignment reporter for the Mount Vernon, New York Daily Argus, and for many years he taught news and feature writing at Columbia University. And of course, he started in 1976. He grew up in Great Neck, New York, and received his BA from the University of Michigan, and he and his wife have parents of two daughters. So we welcome him today, and I will turn the time over to you.
Add to that as of 2.5 years ago, we're the grandparents of 3 children as well, so that's sort of nice. This is a regrettably small crowd, but that's all right. So I'll be more. We can have a conversation, really, and I'm glad to see all of you here. I shouldn't use the word regrettable. It's not regrettable if anybody comes and is interested. So please interrupt me anytime you want with questions, and we'll get this going as a sort of a colloquial discussion. I'm talking about my book, The Disposable American, Layoffs and Their Consequences. It comes out of my work as an economics writer. Much of what is in this book showed up in the Times, not much of it, big chunks of it, not as written in the book, but the themes, the subjects, and so forth. Let me start by giving you some framework, and then I will be as anecdotal as possible, because this is really an anecdotal story. I cover a lot of economics. I think there are few issues in economics of greater significance than job security. And I think worldwide we are engaged in a debate as to what the proper mix should be between job security and insecurity. That is, in a global economy, how much should we allow layoffs to take place in a world in which we produce much more than we consume? And what damage do we do when we let layoffs get out of hand? The Europeans and the Japanese are trying very actively to come up with the right mix. We, however, have acquiesced to layoffs. That is, job security in this country, starting in the late 1900s, rose considerably, right into 1977, almost a century. We found companies like Eastman Kodak and Sears Roebuck, Procter & Gamble, many other of the first multinational companies, in our case companies that had coast-to-coast operations. They found that they needed workers who were dedicated to the companies, who would stay there, who would have initiative. They couldn't be supervised over these large networks. It was particularly true of the railroads. That's where it started. And so out of that need, it was called, it even had a name, it was welfare capitalism. It was management doing it, not unions, but management. And it was called, in that era, pension systems developed, personnel departments developed, various forms of keeping people, training developed, all sorts of things. Then, of course, along came the 30s, and you had a situation where companies were laying people off unemployment rose hugely, and but the government kicked in. The New Deal, with job security in another form. The strike became legal. Probably some of you don't know that it was illegal to strike in this country until the 30s. Franklin Roosevelt got up and said, if I was a worker, I'd belong to a union. And there was all sorts of laws and regulations that came in that strengthened job security. We segued from the Depression into World War II, and by the end of the war, job security was everyone's belief. You couldn't be a politician and argue for flexibility or economic growth. And I'll read you one stump speech from Thomas E. Dewey. Thomas E. Dewey was the Republican candidate for president in 1944, running against Franklin Roosevelt. He was a conservative Republican. And yet he said he was the equivalent of, I wouldn't say Bush necessarily, but he was close to, in the spectrum of politics in those days, he was on the right of the Republican Party. Yet, in a stump speech, he said, if at any time there are not sufficient jobs in private employment to go around, then government can and must create additional job opportunities because there must be jobs for all in this country of ours. Well, if a Democrat, much less a Republican, got up today and said government must create jobs, that's just out of context. It just isn't something that goes on anymore. At any rate, we did, in effect, government did create a lot of jobs. We had the Eisenhower with his interstate highway system. We had Sputnik, which set off the huge outlays in the race for space. These were not necessarily government jobs, that is, moving dirt from one side of the road to another, as Keynes put it, but actual private sector interacting with the public sector. And a healthy economy is one in which the private and the public sector work very well together. A market system usually works best when the two work together. And so but then we arrived in the 1970s. We lost our hegemony. We lost our ability to control the world economy. There was a book called The American Challenge in that era, written by, I forget his name now, but Servan Schreiber, a French journalist, in which he said, beware Europeans, the Americans are going to overrun you. We're going to, they have a juggernaut where business and labor and government and they all work together, and they're going to supply everything that this world needs if you don't wake up. And of course, he was the last. He proved to be absolutely wrong. Within a decade, the opposite was beginning to happen. Well, Japanese cars were beginning to arrive here. We were beginning to come to the realization that we had gotten rather we had gotten out of bound in our costs in labor and everything else. We resorted to layoffs quite legitimately, to labor cost cutting. What happened, however, was that what started as a legitimate solution to a bad situation got out of hand. And over the next 15 years, we gradually dismantled, and I'll illustrate it as I go through the lecture, job security in this country, so that we finally, and we did it with a lot of resistance along the way, but then finally in the mid-90s, around the time that Clinton ran for re-election, and he drove the last nail into the coffin, if you will, we acquiesced. We forgot that job security had a role, and we gave open rein to it. My argument would be that it does now a great deal of damage. Now, how is it that we got to a point that we could acquiesce? What goes through our minds when we say to ourselves, layoffs are all right? Well, we've distorted reality. We blame, I think if I was writing a lead for a newspaper description of my book, I would start with this sentence: people who are laid off blame themselves for their own layoffs. And I found that when you write a book, you go more deeply into the lives of people than you do when you are just reporting a story. You talk to people, you get to know them a little bit, you put them in the story as an anecdote, and you walk away. I got to know people over a long period of time. I also have a practice of keeping in contact with as many as people as possible who appear in my stories. It's a sort of a self-discipline. I believe that when a story is written, there are two people who really know the accuracy, the nuances of a story. The writer, whether it's accurate, and the person who's quoted, or the person who appears in the story. And I find a self-discipline if I keep in contact with those people. I'm very careful, and I don't seek their approval, but I seek to keep this ongoing. And I also find it very useful because I can use people, again, in stories and in books, because what you learn as time goes on is really quite valuable and quite interesting. So what I was finding was I would talk to people, and interviews would go on for this book for a couple of hours. I couldn't cut them off. They were going over why they got laid off, and I would say, look, it's not your fault. This is a social phenomenon. And they'd say no. They'd agree with that perfunctorily, and then they would say, no, it's somehow my fault. It's my bad luck. I was working for the wrong boss. He was insensitive. He didn't judge me right. If only I had been in another department or gotten a better education, another field. Self-blame. In an individualist, in a society that raises the flag to individualism, quite rightly, we've carried it overboard. You lose a job, it's your fault. And then we reinforced it. We do it to this day. Democrats and Republicans alike, and executives, we say, no problem. This is necessary, this flexibility, and all you have to do is get yourself educated and retrained, and you go on to another good job. There's all sorts of good jobs out there that go begging. Reagan used to say, or said once famously, I know there's good jobs out there. I read them in the Sunday classified ads every week. And so you get yourself educated and retrained, and then you don't get a good job. And in fact, most people who get laid off, only about one, these statistics are abundant, only 1 in 3 earns 2 years later is earning as much or more than he or she earned at the job that person lost. One is earning up to 20% less, and one has dropped out of the workforce entirely. And if you don't get that job, it's again your fault. You didn't get the right education, the right training. You did something wrong. And it's a very convenient explanation. It suppresses debate. It's convenient for politicians. They don't have to come up with public policy. It's convenient for corporate executives. It's not their fault, and they're always calling for more education and training in this country and better schooling. And it's convenient even for the labor unions who participate, whose biggest concern is the welfare of the people who and their members who lose jobs, and who I find when I go to these retraining centers, federally subsidized, they're big players in this process. And of course, education and training are a good thing. I mean, there's 2 taxi drivers, and one has only a high school degree and one has a college degree, and there's a engineering job, a college degree in engineering, and an engineering job comes open, the taxi driver with the degree will come open. But there's also Bureau of Labor Statistics, the statistical arm of the Labor Department, runs a biennial survey which makes abundantly clear that about 20% of the workforce is employed in jobs that are beneath their skills. My favorite example is flight attendants. About more than 30% of them have bachelor's degrees. That's a big percentage for a job that doesn't require any college training. It's a hard job, but it's not a college education job. When I've discussed this with airline executives, they acknowledge that. They say, why shouldn't we hire flight attendants with bachelor's degrees if they're available and asking us for jobs? Why should we hire somebody with lesser education when we can have someone with more skill? That translates. One of the stories I've done, and one of the chapters in this book is the story of the United Airlines Maintenance Center, one of the state-of-the-art maintenance center that went up in Indianapolis in the early 90s and late 80s. There's a law that requires airlines to every 5 years dismantle a plane, reassemble it. It's a safety thing. It normally takes about 20 days to do that. A plane is out of service. This center, you could do it for narrow-body jets, and United had this image in its head of having many, many domestic flights with 737s and A319s. It takes the private sector to have the energy and the risk-taking ability to put up a center like this, although it was done largely with the money of the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. At any rate, there was a labor dispute. Everybody's fault, management and labor. The upshot was that the United Airlines shut down the center, outsourced maintenance. 2,400 mechanics were laid off. I went with a number of them to the federally subsidized retraining programs funded by the Clinton administration and Bush. Not well, but fun. And it's heartbreaking to watch these mechanics come to the realization, and these are people who have 2 years of college-like schooling to get a license, come to the realization that the only jobs they're going to get, even with retraining and even another year of college or whatever that they can get from the government, are the jobs that happen to be available anyway in the local area. So what they were ending up doing in Indianapolis, a big trucking center, you could go for 2 weeks, get yourself a commercial trucker's license, go out driving a tractor trailer across country. You can make $40,000. It's not exactly, it's wasted human resource, human capital wasted when you take a highly skilled aircraft mechanic and make him into a truck driver, and you also change the lifestyle. Or they could have been, there were job openings for air conditioner repair, for computer systems, call centers really, and whatever jobs were available in the local area. At the time I was there, CSX was hiring freight train conductors. And so we have a myth. It's your fault, and you can solve your problem with education and retraining. And that's that sort of thought. I'll take a shot at one of my colleagues, Tom Friedman. He sells that in The World is Flat. You know, it's 1, 2, 3, easy stuff. I can't get him into a debate. He's a friend. He doesn't need me. He would fill this room. I don't quite fill it. But education and training doesn't work. Yet we have that as a myth. You're to blame, education and training, so it's your responsibility. If we were to strip away that myth and go back to the idea, the truth, that this is a social phenomenon, that this is something, the way the world works, we would not stop the layoffs, but we would limit them. We would measure each time the damage done by the layoffs to the people involved, and for that matter to the companies, against the value of the layoffs. In the case of Indianapolis, there might have been real protests on the part of the city to stop the layoffs, to keep. There was no good reason, and I won't go into all, for United Airlines to shut that center and outsource the maintenance to cheaper contractors in the south of the United States. And by the way, this is not just international outsourcing. International outsourcing is part of it, but a great part of it is right within this country, where you're just going for cheaper labor. There was not any reason to do that. This center was so efficient that Lufthansa was coming to inquire whether it could service its planes here. This was a center of globalization in the United States that was dismantled. And that's the wrong way to go. So you have people blaming themselves, and there's another bit of damage that I discovered with this book, and that is people who are laid off, and I'm not talking about people who are fired for cause. I'm also not talking about a practice we once had in this country of furloughing workers whenever there was a downturn in the economy, where you kept your identity with your employer and you got called back and you knew you would be. There were hardships, but it was. I'm talking about people who were told in effect that they don't have value, please leave. And there is mental health damage. And I discovered this as I was talking to people. I'll tell you the stories that that illustrated this. It doesn't show easily, but it's there. People don't go for don't go for jobs that really are up to their skills. There's depression. There's trouble with family. People. I went to psychiatrists. They said, yes, we're finding this in our therapy. People come for these for depression or for what have you, and we discover in the therapy and clinical therapy that there's a layoff as a contributing factor. It works differently with different people, but it's there. And I'll read you the dynamics, and I want to make a point. We're talking about layoffs now. Just the act of being told you don't have value, go away, as distinct from employment. Most people who get laid off work again, not at good wages. It's an odyssey to get back to where you were, but our unemployment rate is low. They work again. And we know a great deal about the damage that results from unemployment to mental health, to all sorts of things. We know nothing about the trauma of a layoff because we haven't dealt in it. And yet the psychiatric profession recognizes it. And I was even invited to talk at the American Psychoanalytic Association to make this presentation. The Lehrer NewsHour filmed it. It got shown and everything. I talked to 40 psychoanalysts. I was quite nervous. I thought maybe they'd say, hey, you're full of baloney. And they all agreed. The Lehrer NewsHour took a vote at the end of the lecture, and they all agreed that a layoff is a trauma. And the guy who brought me there, a guy named Ted Jacobs, is a sort of an activist, and he was hoping that the American Psychoanalytic Association would take a stand, put a label on layoffs like we do on cigarettes. This is damaging to your health. Smoke with caution, or you do with caution. The American Psychoanalytic Association and the American Psychiatric Association, for a variety of reasons, won't do this. But the dynamic is this, and Jacobs described it. He's a very prominent psychoanalyst in New York, a teacher at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and New York University School of Medicine. I'm quoting him. Even if a person is accurate in saying, I did a really good job, and I can see that the company is in a bad way, and they have to lay off a lot of people, and it is really not about me, there is seldom an escape from the inner sense of why me. In other words, one has some sense that one has failed, and the outside world has made that judgment, and that self-perception dovetails with existing inadequacies that many people feel about themselves. Now, this works differently in different people. I have people here who have come out quite well. They've got strong egos. They've got solid wives and or spouses, and they've got families behind them, and various reasons they come out all right. But there are two chapters here of white-collar, upper-end blue-collar workers, the aviation mechanics, and white-collar workers. And I kept finding the syndrome the same. And there's about 8 examples. I'll give you 2 of them. Aaron Breen, in his early 30s, a mechanic at United Airlines. He had gone to school at night, gotten his degree as an engineer. He had worked his way up to inspector. His wife, Stacy Prowl, a successful lawyer in Indianapolis, earning well. He, very energetic, eager to go up the line there, had risen to inspector, got himself caught up in the union management dispute. He was tagging conscientiously. He would inspect a repair job and say, this isn't so good. And that would delay the plane coming out. Instead of 11 days, it might take 12 days because an airline has to, if an inspector says something's wrong, you can't just override the inspector. He was accused of doing this for union activism. It wasn't true. That was eventually removed from his record. However, he went for an opening in the engineering department. He was told no because of his attitude. Shortly after, United Airlines decided to gradually shut down the center, lay off all the mechanics, outsource. He lost his job. When I met him, he and his wife had purchased a home in an old Victorian mansion in a sector of the city which had been occupied a century ago by the wealthiest people in the city. It had deteriorated and now is being gentrified. I went to dinner there, and after dinner, they had just had a child. He was laid off. He took me for a walk. He very enthusiastic. I'm going to buy this house. I'm going to buy that house. I'm going to fix it up. He's wonderful with his hands. Had worked on his own house very well. I'm going to flip him with my own labor and make money at it. I said, I can't use this guy in the book. He's too healthy. And that's often what seems to be the first reaction to a layoff. I kept up with him. He didn't buy any houses. The child had been born, and soon after they had a second child. He became the caretaker, very good at it. His wife had to keep working, although their plan was for her to be the primary caretaker and him the primary earner. She prodded him to apply finally, not to use caretaking as an excuse not to look for work, to apply for a manufacturing job, for an engineering job in a manufacturing company. He almost got it, but he managed to screw up the interview and anger. I happen to know him through all this, and anger the interviewer. She tried to jumpstart him in real estate by, in a number of ways. One of them, she actually purchased one of these houses with his passive consent, assuming that faced with having to fix something that they invested in, he would do it. He didn't do it. To this day, he hasn't really fixed it up. What he ended up doing was taking something safe but way beneath his skills. He went to work for the Indianapolis School District. And by the way, his wife appealed to me to try to get him to go to a psychiatrist. He understood there was something wrong. He went to work in a job that he considered he would not be told he didn't have value again. He wouldn't. The Indianapolis School District is a maintenance man. He now, to this day, repairs the boiler systems in schools. And he started at $18 an hour. I think he's now up to $21 an hour compared with about $31 before. But the main thing is he has benefits and he has a safe job. And his wife continues to work as a lawyer. She does it from home. She managed to get a very good deal with her law firm, and that's how they've settled into this. And I have many cases of people who are damaged to the extent that they can't function well again. I'll give you one other, Kenneth Halasian, in his late 40s, earning $160,000, worked all his life at Matthew Bender and Company. Am I running late on this thing? No? All right. Interrupt anytime you want, but I'll open this to questions afterwards. He rose in the ranks. And Matthew Bender is a legal publishing house that puts out rather frequently interpretations of the law, all types of law, marine law, all sorts of things. And he rose in the ranks. They went from paper to digital. He got the job of laying off workers and hiring new ones. They didn't retrain, so he became the layoff person. There were two buyouts. Buyouts is a major source of layoffs, and many of them are unnecessary. But since we've acquiesced to the layoffs, we don't raise objections. We don't judge the buyouts as what's necessary for society and what isn't. In this case, one of those buyouts was probably valuable because it reduced capacity in an industry with too much capacity. The second wasn't. It just meant that there was a lot of debt run up by the acquirer, which was paid for by cutting labor costs, i.e. layoffs. He continued to be an executive, earning $160,000. He took care of the layoffs. He suddenly realized that he was dispensable. And he went to his bosses and pointed out that his job wasn't necessary. So he took the buy. So they said yes. We'd like to keep you, though. Would you go to some place outside New York City? Would you allow us to transfer you where we wish? And he didn't want that. He was burned by his whole experience as the person doing the layoffs and as finally the victim. He took an early retirement. He had $1 million, more than $1 million saved. He figured actually close to $2 million at that particular point in the stock market. Went up and down. He decided he could somehow get through to retirement. He just didn't want to go through this, and he left. when you lay off middle managers in New York, at least, and all over the country, actually, one of the perks of a layoff or an early retirement is you go to an outplacement operation. In this case, right management. I had been watching and finding a lot of my people for stories at Right Management. I had a long relationship with them. He ended up there, and Right Management, in the early days, a decade ago, people who would go there would sulk around and stay in offices with doors closed, and they were shamed. By the turn of the century, when I was doing this book, Right Management had expanded and had rebuilt its offices into all glass, open. Everybody saw everybody else. Acquiescence means no more outward shame. At any rate, they were facing another phenomenon. They were facing the phenomenon of middle managers who didn't want to go back into the workforce, particularly men, but women too, and not wanting to lose the fee from the ex-employer. They set up what they called a portfolio group, a seminar, and I attended it pretty regularly. What should you do with the rest of your life if you don't want to work again? And I would like to point out to you that particularly among prime-age men, working-age men, 20 to 55, the employment-to-population ratio has been dropping steadily for more than a decade, and this is part of it. I did a story about that recently and got all sorts of mail and all sorts of reaction. Some people calling them, the people I used to illustrate this story, lazy. Others saying, "Oh, we know, yeah, we know, we're alienated." So at any rate, they sit around sort of touchy-feely seminars. You don't, some of them are angry. One of the jobs of the outplacement clinics is to suppress that anger. He wanted to do trout fishing. Somebody else wants to be a dancer. But basically what Halasian did was reconstruct in retirement the semblance of a working life, as if he were a child playing house, constructing the semblance of being a wife and mother if you're a girl or whatever. And he did it he got the primary thing he did, I won't go into all the things, was to become the vestryman in his church, actually the chief vestryman. He became what amounted to the CEO of his church, raising money, doing all sorts of things. He would describe these things to me in our conversations and say he constructed a safe world in which he was, quote unquote, working but not working. And I couldn't convince him. The woman who ran those seminars said to me once, if he could get himself a job where he was pretty sure that he wouldn't have to fire people, it would be a normal working situation, he would take it in a heartbeat. And I put that into the book. I didn't tell him that I was going to do that, because every time I raised that issue, he poo-pooed it, and he was quite self-convinced. He was annoyed when he read that. But I sat down with him and with this woman, and we got to talking, and eventually he acknowledged what it was that had happened. He didn't change his ways, and he continues not to work. That's a tremendous loss to the workforce of a skilled person, and it's a tremendous damage to him. We shouldn't inflict such damage on people. Some of it is worse than that, but I'll just give you those two examples. So what we have then is layoffs cannot just be dealt with as a market phenomenon. We can't just deal with them as, the dollars and cents saved. There are other costs that that are social costs that should be borne by all of us, or should be considered in what we do. We can't just blame ourselves, because that's not why you get laid off. And we cannot continue to operate with the myth, which still exists. It certainly was strong at the beginning. If we just get through this downsizing, this cost adjustment, will be all right next year, and the layoffs will stop. We were saying that when this phenomenon began in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and the layoffs continue and continue, and it's become something that we've built into our society, and we shouldn't have done that. So I had to write a solutions chapter for this book, because that's what you do in books. You write solutions. And I wrote a chapter. If you buy this book and read it, and it's on sale out there, I would ask you to read the first 8 chapters, ignore the 9th chapter. If I had it to do over again, I would, as the 9th chapter, write about 3 pages, and I would say, look, relearn your history. Learn what you gave up. What we ceased, learn how we dismantled job security and the damage it's done, and then push back. Make it a social issue again. I'll give you a couple of examples of the of why this. Back in the Harley Davidson, I'll give you that as an example of both the damage to companies the success of companies that avoid layoffs, and most of those who do quite well, and the resistance that used to exist. Back in the 80s, when there was still a lot of concern about job security, Reagan himself, when these large when Harley Davidson was about to go bankrupt because of the arrival of so many hogs, as they call them, from Japanese versions of large motorcycles, he put quotas on them. He pretty much slowed it down. And in that era, we also had, we passed legislation. It was politically necessary, in which employers were required to give 60 days notice on layoffs. A law still on the books, but no more. As we acquiesce, we give up on that. We don't obey. We don't enforce that law, and we don't do import restrictions or anything else. At any rate, he put import restrictions on Harley Davidsons, and on Japanese motorcycles. Harley Davidson rebuilt itself, and it did something very interesting in the days when layoffs were still unacceptable, and which it continues to do. It signed an agreement with its unions in which it said, we have the right to lay people off in the end, but we have an obligation to give you, the workers, when we have to cut labor costs, an opportunity to find some other way short of layoffs to cut the costs. And Boeing, incidentally, did the same thing in the 80s. And so I go to visit Harley Davidson. It's a company I follow. It's a sort of a bellwether company. And the first thing when I get into it with the labor people, the union leaders, they are complaining up and down about this concession and that concession and the other concession. And the management tells me this or that. They fight the battle in the press a little bit. But Harley Davidson has not had a layoff in 10 years. They have done it all with labor cost cutting within the company. And it shows on the assembly line. It shows in the spirit of the workers and in the attachment of the union to the success of the company, despite itself, in the realization that the two of them are in it together, the management and the workers. And that's also a company where the CEO doesn't make an exorbitant amount of money, I might add in there. But and every time I go to a company that has avoided layoffs, they're the most successful. Take Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines has had no layoffs. It's probably the most successful airline in America. It is an airline with short hops, which means they have to have fast turnarounds. Plane has to come in, people have to get off, it has to be cleaned and fueled, and people on and out. One study done by an academic said the average turnaround time for Southwest was 20 minutes, very fast. And the argument by this person, and I see it when I talk to people at Southwest, is that the workers in this company identify with the company, with its interests. They also work in teams in which, since no one's laid off, they know each other. Their own sense of their self is often their sense of what their co-workers think of them. We all sort of judge ourselves as students or teachers of what our skills are and our value by what others think of us. And if layoffs began among those people, there would begin to be an alienation. And instead of a 20-minute average turnaround time, they wouldn't work quite as hard. There would be 21 minutes and 22 minutes and 23 minutes and 25 minutes, and that would be damaging to the company. And I can go on and on with these examples, but the data is pretty clear that companies over the long run that avoid layoffs do quite well. and even in their stock price. So what do we do then? I think we have to push back. How do we go about doing it? What are some tools for doing that? One issue, I'll wait till the question. There's two issues here. One is that we should be counting the layoffs much better than we do right now, which means we count we've counted about 30 million layoffs since the early 80s of full-time workers. If we counted hidden layoffs, forced retirements, it would probably be higher. And instead of 4.3% of the adult workforce every 2 years suffering a layoff, it would be 7%. That's my calculations based on a lot of reporting with the BLS, which doesn't do that calculation. If we forced companies to report every year the disposal of workers, who quit, listing them, who quit, who retired, who got laid off, and we had this huge database, and academics such as exist here would descend on that database, and they would analyze it, and you'd see in the airline industry the average layoff is 100 a month, and here's 2 airlines up at 150 a month. And you would call attention to it. There would be stories in the press. There would be criticism, questions. And CEOs are sensitive to being out of line. The idea of layoffs that they were, outliers in something that is socially damaging. They would restrict themselves, be more careful. These are all little things. I don't have grand solutions. But the main solution is for all of you to buy my book, read it, and go out and push back against it. And I say that a little with humor, but this generation has to relearn what my generation knows, that job security played a big role in the success of this society. And now we've acquiesced to something in a terrible way with all of our politicians agreeing to it. And while Europe and Japan debate actively the right mix of layoff and job security for a successful economy, we don't. Question.
Why do you think that with all of that criticism that is received from the press and other sources that these layoffs still take place?
We don't criticize it. We report them. We say this is necessary. Look at Ford, General Motors. We talk about too much cost of legacy costs, healthcare costs, pension costs. They're uncompetitive. There is a problem there, but we also don't talk about the marketing problems of GM and Ford. And to what extent is the problem because of marketing? We weren't talking about legacy costs when they were selling SUVs. And so we're not having a debate that says, what are the elements here? Marketing, poor design, whatever. Should we be solving this with layoffs? Should the government be picking up the health care costs? Are there other solutions? Remember when Chrysler went under? You don't remember, but back in the late 70s, early 80s, Chrysler was in terrible trouble. And there was a big debate about whether it should be allowed to fail. And it was on the verge of bankruptcy, and there was a bill before Congress, should the federal government guarantee Chrysler loans so that it could get back on its feet? And there was people said, well, the government shouldn't do this. There was other people who said, we can't let so many people go under. We can't let a company disappear that's so important to the economy, suppliers, population, obligation to communities. And the bottom line was that Congress approved a loan guarantee. You don't read about it. You probably don't even know about it. Now we have a similar situation with GM and Ford, and there's differences, but there's no debate at all going on. They're going to come or go as they're going to fail, and it's going to. I was in Michigan last week doing a story. Ford and GM in particular, and Chrysler now, are solving it by layoffs. They're doing it with voluntary buyouts, and they're being amazed that instead of 30 or 40,000 people taking the buyouts, close to 80,000 or more are taking them. I was doing a story out there last week. I still have to write it. Instead, I'm here giving the speeches to you. Trying to figure out what's going through the minds of people. And it's a little bit like my friend Kenneth Alasian. People just don't want to be part of it anymore. They see the handwriting on the wall. They don't have any faith in the companies or the government or anyone else solving the problem, so they take the best deal they can and get out. Other questions?
I do need to mention there, this is the class break time, so some of these students will probably be leaving. So let's just take a few more questions.
Yes, all questions. Yeah, I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
You can talk to them after.
Are there other questions? Because I can go on talking, but I'd rather answer questions. In most of the, go ahead.
I used to work for a really large company, and they went through a layoff time.
You did?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And they laid off probably about 200 individuals that worked there. And what I found was really surprising was like 3 weeks later, they ended up hiring people back. Not the people that they laid off, but other people to replace them. What would you say would be the reason for something behind that?
Well, you have to keep in mind, were you laid off? Everybody in my audience has experienced, not themselves, their parents, something. One of the phenomena that's happening now, and we've written stories about it, is companies lay someone off and then say to them, this is a version of what you're talking about, we're going to replace you, and you have to train your replacement. And until you finish that retraining, staying on an extra month, we won't pay you the severance, and we won't pay you the departure. So it's we've acquiesced so much that we can do that, and it's so easy to lay people off, not to ignore the damage. That you lay someone off and later on you hire them. We used to have an ethic in this country where in a hard time you would furlough someone. And you would say, look, we're having a bit of a hard time. You're still on the payroll, but you're out on the street for a while. We'll call you back. You still have your seniority, your identity, everything. That's much different than a layoff and being told to go away. That was a standard way of doing it. We've given that up. You get rid of people, and often, let's be very clear about this, layoffs have been discovered by companies, particularly in an era when unions are so weak, as a means of lowering labor costs, both in this country, the outsourcing of aviation repair, maintenance to the South, and through outsourcing abroad. Often, sometimes necessarily, if it's very labor intensive, and often unnecessarily, and never with a debate in which all the costs are measured and there's an acknowledgement that companies are doing it to cut labor costs, despite the damage that results. And if you had that discussion, you might, there's somebody, the Sloan Foundation, a perfectly respectable American foundation, the leader of it says, we should have taxes we should tax companies that go to China and then import their stuff back. Maybe they should pay a special tax on what they don't make here, what they import back. We don't have that discussion. I don't think that's a good idea myself, but we don't even have the discussion. And again, we're not having the discussion about GM and Ford. I'm over-answering your question, but my answer is that we've acquiesced to the point that they can throw people away, and when they need somebody, they bring them back, often the same workers at lower pay or temps or whoever.
How would you say that that's different than just firing the person then? If you're going to tell the person that we need you to train the person who's going to replace you, I don't understand exactly what the difference is between a layoff and just firing the person.
Well, we're using terms. Layoff is firing I would like to use as a term. You fire someone because they are not a good worker. They don't have the skills. They're lazy. They show up late. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. It's been going on in this country for generations, and it should continue to go on. That is a judgment that says this person really is a disappointment. That's a firing. A layoff is when a company decides we need to get rid of 28 people. And so we get rid of 28 people. Sometimes it's the least valuable workers, although they're almost always valuable, and sometimes it's just anybody. Very often you find valuable workers being fired. Jack Welch, who became famous in this whole process as the leader of General Electric, he started a rating system in which he would rate workers 1 to 10, and if you weren't near the top, you were more risk of layoffs than before. So you fired the people who were ones, and then the people who were fives eventually became ones when you cut the bottom. It was just a system. Do I answer that question? Any
I still
other
think
question?
it's wrong that they do that, though.
What? Wrong to do what?
I just think layoffs are wrong. It's not
Well,
right to
I
do
agree
that to
with you.
people.
Go ahead.
Let's do this. Let's go ahead and end the formal part, and then if you guys want to stay around and ask other questions, because we're just about to our next.
Okay. Why don't we take this one question in case you want to.
What, outside of those suggestions you gave us in your lecture, what suggestions do you have for us, aside from changing the entire system? What can we, as we're entering into the workforce as soon as we graduate from college, what should we look for to avoid being laid off, or what should we look for to keep our job secure?
Well, there's no way to avoid being laid off. I would say that when you're young, in your 20s, you're trying to find your place in the workforce, and you might yourselves bounce around a bit, or a company might decide you're really not good at something. But try when you do pick a profession and make a commitment to a skill and to a company, try the best you can to pick a company that has a minimum number of layoffs. There are a number out there. I don't have an answer. My answer is not that you, the individual, can save yourself. It has to be a social, communal thing. It has to be all of us together doing something. And I don't know how to do that, except that there are movements around that are beginning to try to do that. Usually they're community movements.